It's a touchy genre, you guys. I've really found that people get really, really angry. Hey guys, what's going on? I hope you're doing well. This week, I actually wanted to go over kind of like dark romance, almost more like a beginner's guide. I will say that I am kind of approaching this in a way that's more my own opinion. The way I kind of view dark romance is much more of an umbrella. I see it kind of almost like more of a marketing term than it is a genre. I actually feel like a bunch of subgenres or genre, however you want to put it, exist underneath this term, and that every I don't know, decade or so, dark romance seems to be a new thing. Because I did a ton of research on this, you guys, just because I've been trying to find my own dark romance that I would enjoy, because I'm not really into what is kind of on trend right now, which is more of what I call the dark toxic storyline. But that's personally just not my vibe. So I was trying to figure out where are the books that I'm looking for? So I kind of went down a black hole. By the way, just as a little side note, for those of you who did jump on this video and you're looking for more of kind of like what's on trend recs for that sort of dark toxic vibe, I have some, but if you're looking for someone who really enjoys the genre, has really good recs, has a lot of good things to say, go check out Jess from Honest Fiction. I actually think she just did a video where she basically interviewed a bunch of different booktubers and they all mentioned their favorite dark romance. And then I'd also recommend Jen from the Book Refuge. She also has a lot of great books and a lot of things to say for dark romance. So, getting back on topic here, I want to do a beginner's guide here. I basically have kind of like 6 to 7 subgenres that I want to introduce you to. I will give you books, I'll give you recommendations, I will give you authors. Hopefully you guys will get a better understanding of kind of the different sort of dark elements that you can have within a story, so you can kind of figure out what avenue is your right level of dark. So before we jump into that, something that I want to say about dark romance is it's very broad in its sort of definition. It only really has 2 descriptors, which is why I feel like it's more of an umbrella term. It's more of a marketing term here. But the only 2 things that you have to have is that it has dark themes. That's vague. And then it needs to have mature content. And the mature content could be a variety of things. It could mean sexually, it could be, I don't know, BDSM, knife play, blood play, breath play, whatever. Or it can have something to do more so with your character. Maybe they're incredibly violent. Maybe they're a villain. Maybe they're struggling with some sort of mental illness. Maybe they're a psychopath. It could be a variety of different things that can be considered mature content, because you're already going into a book that's dealing with things outside of societal norms. It's kind of pushing your morals and seeing where you're kind of willing to kind of fluctuate on your beliefs, which is one of the reasons why I think this is actually such a touchy genre, because I went into a lot of Reddit threads and it's interesting how heated people get. What was considered dark romance 10, 20 years ago is not the same thing as what we consider it today. The dark toxic romance that's super, super on trend right now, that's kind of giving people this idea that that's what dark romance is. That's what it has to be. But the people of 10 to 20 years ago, they're getting heated, man. They do not want to be associated with people who read dark toxic. And I think the reason why that is because dark themes, going back to that descriptor, can be a lot of different stuff. And again, it's going outside of those societal norms and pushing where your morals really lie and where you're kind of willing to fluctuate a bit. So obviously everybody's going to have their own sort of moral beliefs on what's okay, what can you break, what can't you break, what's off limits, what's on limits. So it's a touchy genre, you guys. I've really found that people get really, really angry. And as I did my research, dark romance has changed so much. There was a period of time where it was more specifically almost like dark carnal desires, more of your erotic stuff, think BDSM, things like that. Sort of sexual nature that you kind of hide behind closed doors, things you don't discuss. There's another period of time where it was really explicitly more of your Gothic style of romance, where you have those horror and suspenseful elements. You had a time when it was more Edgar Allan Poe-esque. So it's fluctuated so much over the years, and it's going to continue to do so. So I really think it just has to do with what's actually trending at the time, is when it's actually being used as a marketing term. So I just want to help you find what your dark romance is. So I'm going to go over a variety of different things. So why don't I stop jib-jabbing? Actually, no. I'm not going to stop jib-jabbing. I have something else to say. Why I think you actually will like dark romance. Sorry, I know this video is very chaotic. I have a lot of thoughts and it's just all fluttering around up here. Why I think you'd actually enjoy dark romance, regardless if you're someone who comes from your regular style, more fluffy style of romance, which if that's where you want to stay, that's totally fine. You don't have to read dark romance if you don't want to. I'm just saying why I think you might like it. What's really interesting about it is your dark romance starts to go into characters who are broken or breaking or doomed. Really the ones that were kind of classically always the antagonists in your traditional storylines. You're getting to watch how that character would fall in love when they already have this vision of the world. It's already such a dark place. So seeing how they would approach falling in love is going to be totally different than what you get in sort of your classic style of romances. It's usually much grittier. It's much heavier on the emotions. It can be a lot more gut-wrenching. So there is such a great like literary quality that you can go into with dark romance, and that's definitely going to happen within certain genres. A lot of times there's kind of like this redemption storyline because you're usually dealing with a character who's really not perfect, has a lot of flaws, and they're kind of latching on to whoever, let's say, our female love interest is. They're latching on to her as almost like she's the last shreds of their humanity. So she's going to be able to bring them out of this. There's that hope basically at the end of the book that the reader really gets to hold on to. So they move through all of this immense amount of drama, but they always have this hope to kind of latch onto. So it's so gratifying when you get to the end and you're dealing with a character like that and you see that growth or you see the massive struggle that they went through. So it's fun to kind of read in that regard. Will you cry? I mean, maybe not in every book, but you definitely can. Sorry, that's my bedtime alarm. But anyways, it's just a really interesting genre. Speaking of that redemption thing, by the way, you don't always have to have redemption. Especially right now, that seems to be very popular. The more dark, toxic sort of style is almost, not always, but you don't necessarily have to have that redeeming quality. You can just have that love interest, that man who is quite frankly very, very terrible, and your main character that you're following basically has to learn to live within this sort of environment now, and you're kind of watching her growth kind of diminish into their world, if you will. Sometimes she's going to be the reason he can come out of that world, and other times it's just going to be him sucking her in. So again, you can go in a variety of different ways. This is just such a broad term. Okay, the subgenres now. Sorry, I know I'm jib-jabbing. I feel like I could go on and on about this. I kind of feel like this is actually one of those topics for like book people that this could actually be a really like deep discussion. But anyways, the actual subgenres that I personally feel are under the dark romance umbrella, or dark romance can be used as a marketing term for. So the seventh one, this one's kind of distinctly different than the others. So if you look at my graphic here, I have 7 altogether, but this line is kind of delineating where 6 are cohesive and 1 is not. And so this is more of your, I call it more of your dark carnal desires. This is more of the erotica period of history that was considered dark romance. I think honestly, because Americans are kind of very prudish, we had a tendency to, when it came to like sexual stuff, think BDSM, things like that. Your darker sort of sexual acts, if you will. It's not very vanilla. You don't really discuss that. You kind of hide that, right? So I think that's why it was considered dark romance back in the day. But this usually doesn't always have like that sort of distinct abusive nature that we're seeing right now. So a lot of times people who really considered this dark romance really steer far away from the dark toxic side and don't associate that with being dark romance at all. So things like these sort of books, this is going to be more of your dark carnal acts, BDSM, things of that nature, okay? So basically what I have here, you could think, this is a good example. I know a lot of people hate this book, but 50 Shades of Grey would have fallen into this, but the BDSM side of that really wasn't done well. So I know everyone's gonna have their own issues with it, but that's gonna give you an idea of kind of what this sort of subgenre is all about. There's also like, you could read Sleeping Beauty Anne Rice. I can't remember her name, but Anne Rice is the one who technically wrote it. That's really dark. That definitely has its own issues in it, but it's very, very erotic. You could have people like, let's say Vera Valentine. This is going to be, it's not quite comedic, but she has more of that crazier sort of situations, but it definitely has that erotic element in it. Katie Robert does a lot of stuff that can be more of your dark carnal desires. So think of those sort of people, think of those sort of storylines where you're just dealing with more of your dark carnal sexual acts. Maybe you still have kidnapping, maybe you still have consent, non-consent within it, but a lot of times this isn't necessarily going to be like your heavy abusive sort of storyline. BDSM, by the way, if you're not familiar with it, like there's a distinction of what BDSM is, and it's not abusive. So everyone's very aware of what's going on. But anyways, that's kind of the first one, and that's kind of very separate from all the other 6. The other 6 really have to deal more with those characters and really a plot line outside of the sexual nature of things. Like I mentioned in a video, a couple videos back, erotica is, the plot line really is about the sex and sexual awakening, where all of these other 6 that I have for you, it's much more about the plot and the mood and the atmosphere or other certain elements. So we'll get into those. First being the dark toxic. Since that is the one that is massively on trend right now, this is really the ones that you can think of. A lot of times they're going to be your mafia books, your motorcycle books. They can deal with like kidnapping, sex trafficking. There's usually quite a bit of abuse, if you will. Sometimes it's not necessarily like physical per se, but it can definitely be mental and emotional. You're dealing with much more of a very villainy sort of character, morally gray. I think it kind of goes past that. There's a lot of times where you can have things that it's kind of degrading. You definitely have power imbalances there. You can have those stalkers, like situations, honestly, that in real life you would be like, oh, hell no. Like they're very obvious red flags. But for those of you who like to read dark toxic sort of stuff, again, go check out Jess's channel and Jen's channel. They'll have way more recs than I do, and probably a lot more to actually say on that, because this typically isn't my sort of vibe. But the ones that I have are Haunting Adeline. I think a lot of people are very familiar with that. I think that gives you a really great idea of what sort of dark toxic is. And then there's this other book called Heartless Heathens, and this gives you an idea of how I'm not into this, because this was actually a book that I said I wanted to burn. And that's because for me, I have nothing against the people who read dark toxic. I was telling Hannah, I think it's my Irish side, because apparently there is a point where I just want to start fighting characters when they do certain things, and I get mad and I'm not enjoying it anymore. I just want to beat the shit out of the character. It's not that I want to beat the hell out of the author. I still have mad respect for the author, but I hate the character and what they're doing, so I just want to fight their ass. So it's not a romance for me anymore at that point. But this is another one where there's other booktubers, Jess included, who really, really enjoy it. So again, definitely check out her channel. You could get like Katie Robert books, Sophie Lark, Emily McIntyre, all sorts of different authors will pop up honestly for you right now, because this is on trend. So this is going to be the easiest sort of dark romance book to basically find right now, because marketing as it's going is really kind of using this sort of storyline, these sort of books, as its sort of definition for dark romance, which again, not what I personally believe. I just think it's just for our time. But anyways, moving on from there. I hope I'm making sense here, you guys. I have no idea. But anyways, moving on from there. Gothic romance. This is another one that I consider dark romance, just because it has the dark themes, it has the mature content. You're dealing with a storyline that pulls a lot from mystery and horror. There's usually a good amount of suspense in here, but the main thing about it is really this sort of mood that it elicits, and that's because your Gothic storylines are gonna typically be in isolated areas. They're going to be in things like cathedrals or old dilapidated castles, things like that. There's a very specific mood that almost, like if you're a visual sort of reader like I am, I see images. There's this almost like cover of gray that goes over everything. And because of the very specific locations that you are at in a Gothic romance, it naturally has that dark vibe, and those horror elements, those suspenseful elements, give it those dark themes. You're still going to be dealing with characters or situations that are usually pretty terrifying. A lot of times you're dealing with things that are quite religious. That's very common in Gothic stuff, which that includes the paranormal, especially ghosts, demons, things like that. That harkens back into the whole religious sort of territory. Vampires even, the whole blood sucking, a lot of stuff relates back to that into religion. So Gothic just has this mood, this certain vibe that is just very distinctly dark. And dark romance actually used to be a subgenre underneath Gothic back in the day, oddly enough. But I feel like, again, dark romance has become an umbrella term. So Gothic romance is something that I consider. I basically put down as far as some book recs for you guys. Master of Salt and Bone, which is on KU, Gothicana, and Fairy-Dale. Some authors that you guys can look up is like Veronica Lancet, Carrie Lake, Rue Nix, lots of them. Gothic romance is actually pretty easy to also search. It's very close in the sense of dark toxic romance, just because Gothic has just been so well known for such a long time. You know, but again, I consider it under the dark romance umbrella because of that mood that it gives. We're no longer in the whole fluffy side of your classic romance where you're dealing with your Prince Charming. This is going to have much heavier emotions, much heavier situations that you're going through. So moving on from there, talking about kind of the mood, I call this personally myself dark atmospheric, which, full transparency, I have not found my perfect book yet for dark atmospheric. And this is actually what I'm looking for. This was what I always thought dark romance was when I first went into it. Again, dark romance is just like, it's kind of difficult to peg down when you're searching for books. But dark atmospheric to me is like Gothic, except you take out the elements that you have to be in an isolated area, that you're in these dilapidated castles or these cathedrals. Take those locations completely out of it. You're just existing in a world that has more of that darker element, that sort of shade of gray over everything. To kind of give you an image, this isn't romance, but I think everyone's going to be able to see what I'm saying. Game of Thrones is very much that dark atmospheric, and a lot of that has to do with the characters that are within it and the situations that are going on and how they interact with one another, right? So it's more of that sort of dark atmosphere, if you will. So the closest stuff that I have read, it wasn't my perfect romance, but I felt like it definitely had the dark atmospheric vibe, was actually To Bleed a Crystal Bloom. I think that book was so amazing when it came to the atmosphere side of things. It actually has the dark toxic elements, more of the kind of abusive sort of nature where you're just like, God, like, just get out of this. This isn't good. This isn't healthy. It has more of that sort of romance in it. I've only read the first book so far, but when you actually look at the world, everything about it like had this shade of gray within it that was so amazing, and it had to do with the characters and the creatures, how they interacted, that really kind of created that dark atmosphere. Also, like, they are in a castle, but it's not like they're in this dilapidated castle that's isolated from everywhere else. It's always storming. There's always the lightning in the clouds, very Dracula. It's not like that, you know? So To Bleed a Crystal Bloom, I think, is a good example of the atmosphere side of things. You could also kind of say A King of Battle and Blood. She did a great job of, again, because the creatures are present and like the way that she describes the sky, especially in the vampire area, there is kind of a dark atmospheric element to it, but I use that as like a loose sort of representation. I feel like To Bleed a Crystal Bloom is a much better one. Another great one, actually, this was a book that I did get bummed by. It's by Karina Halley. It's called River of Shadows. Basically a girl going into the underworld. The first half of the book, so darkly atmospheric. And that's because she took those horror elements. She made this world where there's this creepy sort of mood that's this kind of eerie, very similar that you get in your Gothic romance, but again, you're completely outside of those locations. You just exist now in a dark world. You're not in a dark building. You're in a dark world. I guess that's a good way to actually kind of distinguish between Gothic and dark atmospheric. But that one was a really great example, especially in the first half of the book, where you're just kind of like, oh, whoa, okay, where the heck am I? You're kind of getting those horror vibes, you know? So that was also a great one. So some authors that you can kind of think of, this is where, like I said, it's hard because the transparency of me not finding my perfect book. This is a very difficult one to search for. Heads up on that. I've been trying really, really hard, but I can't seem to really find it. So again, the only ones I really know of are Karina Halley. Oh my God, I can't remember the name. St. Clair, the one who wrote A King of Battle and Blood. I haven't read her other books though, so that might be a bad author, honestly. And then the author of To Bleed a Crystal Bloom, which I can't remember right now. I'm so sorry. But yeah. Anyways, talking about the horror side, talking about Karina Halley, I consider horror romance also to be under dark romance, the dark romance umbrella. But your horror romance really is going to have all of your classic horror sort of vibes. There's usually a lot of suspense involved. You're going to have a very clearly distinct villain. Maybe they're your love interest, maybe they're not. You're going to have those elements where it's very terrifying, it's disturbing, if you will. So horror romance, I totally think has to belong under dark romance because obviously it's very clearly dark. It's got those dark themes. But the ones that I have for this, I think a really great example is actually The Wicked and the Willing. I have that behind me, by Leon Yutan. Yeah, I think that's how it's pronounced. But by Leon Yutan. This is a great example, really. This is where you can get some really great, like, literary romance, in my opinion. This is a great literary book. It's not focused on the steam or any sort of erotic element. It's present, more on the light side, but it is present, but it's so very focused on the actual story itself, and you get those disturbed sort of vibes. You see the villain and you see who they are and how they're interacting with everybody, and you're just kind of like, oh, this isn't right, and you know things are going to come, but you can't help the characters in any form or fashion. So that's a really great book that describes horror romance. The Karina Halley stuff, those books, she has a lot of horror romance, or at least that's how she's marketed it as horror romance, including The River of Shadows, but she has a variety of other books. She has quite a few of vampire books that are also considered horror romance. Harley LaRoe, she's another good one. Her Soul to Take, that's a great book as an example. So horror romance I don't think is too bad when it comes to kind of searching up for your books. Because dark toxic is very on trend right now, a lot of those toxic elements can sometimes be put into the horror romance, really any of these sort of subgenres, and I really think that's because the books are selling. So authors are obviously going to be putting those elements into these other subgenres sometimes. So I can't always promise you that that stuff won't be present. That's where it's good to check your trigger warnings and things like that. Moving on from there, your more gory thriller sort of romances, that I consider dark romance because it's still typically a horror romance, but now you're getting a lot of blood. So that in and of itself is a dark theme. That is mature content. So it fits the whole dark romance sort of descriptors. This is kind of hard to find. When you put in like gory, I find it easier if you say slasher romance. I've found a couple, especially right now since we're in the whole Halloween time, but these aren't super popular. They're not very prevalent, basically, but you can find them. A good example of this, I'm currently reading it. It's called Cute But Psycho. It's fantastic. Literally your first sentence is talking about bodies being on meat hooks. We're already living inside of the darkness. But this is a lot of fun. I like your kind of gory sort of romance. I think it's just so different from your classic romance because you're still taking your romance elements that make you feel giddy and good inside, and then you're taking the gory blood of just like your horror sort of books and you're mashing them together. Like I think it's fun. They're two extremes coming together. So I actually really love this. Cute But Psycho has been really good so far. I haven't finished it, but basically you can think of it as like Harley Quinn falling in love, being inside of her psyche while she's falling in love. It's a great time. Authors that you can look for in this is like Lux Oleander, Beatrix Hollow, and Tyler Page. Those are some authors that I have for you. Again, when you're searching for it, it's probably better if you say slasher romance rather than gory. You can try bloody romance, but I feel like slasher romance will pull up more of what you're looking for. So anyways, the last one that I have, for those of you who are just kind of like, I don't want all of this. I just want a touch of darkness. There is actually a subgenre for you. I only know it really on the historical romance side of things. I'm sure it exists in fantasy romance or other sort of romance genres, but the ones that I have read have all been historical. And this is actually called noir. A lot of times you'll see it as Regency noir within historical romance. And basically what you have is you still have your classic historical romance storyline, which is very sweet and it feels good moving through it. But typically you're dealing with a character, and it's usually the love interest, who is broken in some fashion. Maybe something really, really serious happened to them. Maybe some sort of assault happened in their past. So it makes it difficult for them to kind of interact with the woman that they're presently have in front of them right now. They can be a lot of times more harsher, or they're just more reserved. You can also be dealing with characters who are actively more in the mindset of just wanting to unalive themselves, and your female character might be trying to help them get out of that. So this is more of your noir situation. You're not dealing with any form of abuse, you're not dealing with gore, you're not dealing with violence. You're dealing more with a person who has some sort of mental barrier that they kind of have to get through in order to fall in love. There's some sort of struggle that's going on internally. So I actually like these books. I think they're great. I think that's where, like, there's a lot of historical romances that I like that are this more noir type, and I think that's why I keep trying to find it in my fantasy romance, just because I want that more kind of deeper gratification at the end, because you see this really big struggle, you know? But the examples that I have for you are going to be Duke of Desire by Elizabeth Hoyt, Untouched, one of my favorite books of all time. That's by Anna Campbell. That actually deals with a character who he's basically been imprisoned, you can basically say. He's been treated very, very poorly, and he's thinking about unaliving himself, and then this girl kind of gets caught up in everything. It's a great book. Highly recommend you read it. And then The Pirate Prince. So that's also a storyline where you have a character who's dealt with abuse in the past, and he basically wants revenge. Those are more of your noir style of books. I'm sure they're present. I would almost kind of say Death's Obsession, which that was a recent read that I had that dealt a lot with mental struggles and was very, very sad. Very, very sad. But there is a little bit of a stalkerish vibe that gives you the dark, toxic element. It's not that bad, though. He's very sweet, and she enjoys it. It's hard to describe, but you could kind of call that more of a noir sort of thing, because it's dealing more with the mental struggles of one of the characters. So those are technically the 7 different subgenres that I have for you. Hopefully that all made sense. My mind is very chaotic, so maybe it didn't. To give you a quick run through again, your more dark carnal desires is your erotic storyline that's focusing on sexual awakening, and it's usually more within your darker sort of sexual acts. Can be things like BDSM. You have your noir books, which are going to deal more with focusing on a character who's dealing with mental struggles, but you're not really going to have any sort of that violence. You're not going to have any sort of like abuse actively happening on the pages. You're not going to have that gore, that horror. None of that will be in there. It's really just you have a character who's dealing with some mental struggles that makes it hard for them to move through the world and to fall in love. You have your dark atmospheric, which is going to give you really, you're existing inside of this dark sort of world. There's a lot of harsh qualities to this world. It doesn't matter what your location is, it just all feels like there's this darkness in it. A lot of times dealing with the creatures that are present, or just kind of the struggles that all of the people are kind of going through. There's usually hardship going on here. Your Gothic storyline, this is where you're in a dark location. Usually it's isolated. You're dealing a lot with the divine. You're dealing a lot with the religious sort of stuff. You can deal a lot with the paranormal. You're going to have usually mystery elements and horror elements and suspenseful elements within this storyline. You have horror romance, which is very much like your traditional horror book. You're going to have a very clear, distinct villain or monster. You may fall in love with them, you may not, but you're really going to have those terrifying sort of moments where you get really scared. You're living inside of this environment that is kind of disturbing to you and disturbing as the reader. You have gory thriller sort of romance, which is very similar to your horror side, except now you're going to be dealing with a crap ton of violence. It's going to have a lot of blood, like a huge amount of blood. Horror romance can still have blood as well, but gore is on a whole other level. The blood is very much prevalent. These violent acts are very, very prevalent to the storyline. And then lastly, your dark toxic, which is the one that's on trend right now, which this is going to be where you're dealing with characters who are not always looking for redemption. They're just kind of more of your morally gray villain sort of individuals who aren't afraid to unalive someone. They're not afraid to kidnap. You can be dealing with those consent, non-consent sort of barriers. There's usually that power dynamic that's present within this sort of storyline. So your very clear red flag situations in real life are something happening in these sort of storylines that you kind of get to enjoy, see play out. Okay, so those are the 7 different ones that I have. If you agree, cool. If you don't agree, also cool. I'm just trying to help y'all out as a content creator. I'm trying to make it easier for you guys when I recommend things or when I describe books. I want to try and give as many descriptors as I can so you have an easier time understanding what the book actually is and if you're actually going to like it. So this is how I see it, and this is how I kind of want to kind of rate my books, if you will, moving on into the future, because I am still trying to find my perfect dark romance book. For me, again, it's dark atmospheric. So anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed that. I'm sure I ranted for a long time. If you're still here, thanks. You're amazing. But if you have any of your own thoughts or if you have any recommendations for dark atmospheric or the gory stuff, you let me know. Okay, or the horror romance. I'll take those too. I like those a lot. Anyways, I will talk to you guys later, and I will see you next Friday. Okay? Bye.